Growing up in Maine, my dad liked to take my brother and me with him when he went fishing. We would go further north toward the Canadian border. Dad had lots of pet ponds he liked to visit. This all happened when we were quite young. Mom was out of town for the weekend visiting with my aunt, and it was just me, Dad, and my little brother Kyle, who was barely 4 years old. I was all of 8 and had built something of a reputation for myself for being too mischievous for my own good. I was always wandering off, playing in places I shouldn't have been, coming home covered in mud, and generally causing my parents grief. I played nice on the days that Dad took me fishing, though. It was one of my favorite ways to spend time with him. And I knew that acting out on one of these trips could mean being banned from the boat for the rest of the summer. Our choice of water was Moosehead Lake and many of the ponds surrounding it. I can't remember which of the ponds we chose that summer, but I remember our catches being particularly good. We were reeling in smallmouth bass that day. We hit our limit pretty early, but as it was such a nice day, we were happy to just sit in the boat for a while, floating around and goofing off. Kyle, who was still too young to fully grasp or have the patience required for real fishing, occupied himself plenty with a toy rod that he had brought from home. He would just practice casting out over and over, immediately reeling back the line every time. While we were out there on the pond, I remember Dad telling a story. I think it was something about when he was young, and his dad used to take him fishing at Moosehead Lake. I only vaguely remember the conversation, less because of what he was talking about, and more because of the sound that interrupted him. It started soft, almost muffled in the distance. Dad didn't notice, but I did. My eyes wandered over to the trees, somewhere in the direction of the sound. I didn't see anything then. I barely heard what I heard. Dad heard it too, though, because he suddenly stopped talking and looked over his shoulder in the same direction. It sounded like stock footage from an old movie that takes place in a jungle, like a howler monkey or an ape. It was a true bellow, wild and loud. It started short and soft before ringing loud, like an engine sputtering to life. I was mesmerized. Dad seemed less so. Kyle was giggling. I suppose he was thinking the sound was some kind of trick or show. Dad paddled us away without saying anything. It was only after we got what I suppose he figured was a safe distance away that he chuckled and said, "Whew, that sounded like some animal, huh?" I asked him what kind of animal it was, and he said that it could have been any number of things, but he wasn't an expert on such things, so he couldn't say for sure. I know now that he was just talking for the sake of talking. He had no idea what made such a noise. After all, how could he? We kept floating and circling the pond, though always remaining in the opposite direction of where we heard the noise. I became restless, of course, so we eventually came ashore and had lunch. The entire time we chewed our food, I was uncharacteristically quiet. I could tell it was worrying my dad, the way he was saying that maybe we should get home early since we had already hit our limit so fast. No sense rowing around the pond if we weren't going to be catching any more fish. I protested immediately. Of course, weird sounds aside, I had been looking forward to spending the whole day at the lake, and I wasn't so easily spooked. I think kids like me are why I don't have any of my own even now that I'm married. Recalling all of this is making me realize how much I must have stressed out poor Mom and Dad. But Dad eventually relented and said he'd row us around a little longer if I promised to behave. At some point, while we were sitting in the boat, Kyle complained to my dad that he needed to go potty. I don't know what kind of weird plan my 8-year-old mind was trying to concoct, but I was adamant that Dad drop me off at a nearby sandbar while he took Kyle to go potty. I could tell Dad knew I was up to something, which is funny because I couldn't even tell what I was up to. I just couldn't stop thinking of that animal call, and I'd spent every second I could since we'd heard it just squinting out at the other side of the pond. The sandbar wasn't too far from shore, though, and even I knew better than to just go swimming out in the pond, fully clothed with no flotation device or real destination. So Dad relented and dropped me off, keeping a wary eye on me the whole time he rowed Kyle back to land. I turned my back on the two of them, looking out toward the opposite tree line where I first heard the sound. It didn't take long before my eyes wandered to something out in the water, something at first that was barely a speck in my vision. I had to really strain to see what was happening in the glare of the afternoon sun. Whatever it was floating. My first thought, without being able to see a whole lot of detail or make out the exact edges of this thing, was that maybe it was an overturned rowboat or canoe drifting listlessly around the pond. But then it moved. It moved, and it floated closer in my direction. Not a whole lot, mind you. Hard to say the distance this far into the future, but it was still a great deal away from me, like I could have squished the image of this thing between my thumb and forefinger if I squinted through one eye and held my hand up to my face. But the more it moved, the clearer it became. I saw more details. For one, it was quite dark, mostly black, but sometimes brown when the sun shone down on it the right way. I think that was my first clue that whatever I was looking at was covered in hair or fur. When it moved, I saw that it had great big limbs. Where its hands would have been, there was a slight absence of hair. I could see where its palms would be, and they looked fleshy in color. That was the most I could make out at first. I kept glancing over my shoulder and then back at this thing. I was keeping tabs on my dad, who was almost certainly keeping tabs on me, and wondering if he would get back in time to see what I was seeing. The creature never got much closer than that, though. The way it was moving, it definitely resembled swimming, although not in the way that humans swim, not with a purpose or direction, but just ambling down the water on its back and letting the small amount of motion carry it to and fro. Its arms moved, but not to get anywhere. It wasn't doing a backstroke or even pushing water out of its way. It just listed aimlessly. Honestly, if I had to assign any actual purpose to what it was doing, I'd probably say it was just relaxing. How nice does it sound to just float on your back on the surface of a calm pond in the middle of a Maine summer in the 90s? Boy, I'd kill for that right about now. Anyway, needless to say, Kid Me was in equal parts confused and excited. I still didn't quite know what this thing was. I don't think I was too young to hear things about Bigfoot, but what I had heard equivocated to passing jokes on television and old playground stories. That is to say, such a thing didn't come to mind right away. I was more convinced that I was looking at a gorilla that might have escaped from a nearby zoo and was now making its home here in the forest near Moosehead Lake. And then it got up. That's when my 8-year-old mind darn near exploded. It turned over slowly in the water and righted itself to stand upright on its feet, still partially submerged in the pond. I wish I knew for sure how deep that water went, but even if I knew the depth in one place, there was no way I would have been able to tell how deep the pond got at any given location throughout. I'm sure it varied depending on where you were. Even then, though, it was hard to miss how big this creature was. I could still get some semblance of scale from its surroundings. To my 8-year-old brain, I knew for a fact that it was taller than Dad, and while Dad is of fairly average height, I could tell that it was taller than him by a great deal. It was hard not to let all the excitement building up in my little body turn immediately into fear. But I wasn't scared just yet. I was still too bullheaded to think that I was in any kind of danger. After all, it didn't get up to look at me. As it got up on its 2 feet, straightening out and standing quite like a human would, its back was facing me. And I just kept hoping that it would please turn around to face me so I could get a better look. I blame all the movies they fed us when we were kids about other children befriending wild animals with little to no consequences. I wanted to live the movie about my life where I would make friends with whatever this thing was, and we would go on adventures together without a care in the world. In any case, what it actually did was dive under the water. Now, it was at this time that I really wanted Dad to be seeing what I was seeing. But when I looked behind me, he was still standing vigilant behind my brother and only looking back at me with quick glances, mostly just wanting to make sure I was still alive and hadn't been snatched up by an eagle or something. I opened my mouth to tell him to come see, but I also didn't want to scare him and leave my brother by himself. So no words really came out. When I checked back to see the creature again, all I saw were ripples in the spot where it had gone under. Dad told me later that I was doing a little dance with my feet that he took to mean that I needed to go potty too. I just kept turning in a circle, looking out at the water and back at my dad, not saying anything, but wanting to scream on the inside. When the creature came back up, it was without fanfare, almost stealthy. It rose above the surface of the pond, water rolling off of it in big globs and rivulets, and this time it was facing towards me, and it had a fish in its mouth. I can see why someone might mistake a creature like this for a bear, especially if this is how it fishes in the areas that it does. But unlike a bear, I could see now that its face was clearly not as hairy as the rest of its body, much more gorilla-like. Had it been any smaller or stood hunched over, I probably would have definitely called it a gorilla. I watched Bigfoot walk very casually back towards the shore, fish still weakly flopping in its mouth, and turn away from me as it retreated into the forest. That was when I started panicking, and noises finally came out of my mouth. I just yelled for my dad, saying, "It's leaving! It's leaving! Come quick!" I pointed at it and looked toward my dad, who was finally picking up my brother and headed toward the boat. At the sound of me shouting, he rushed in and rowed toward me as fast as he could. But it was too late. In a flurry of words and sentences that I'm sure didn't make much sense given how excited I was, I described the creature to Dad, trying to tell him what it did and what it looked like. He listened politely for a little while before telling me to take a deep breath and explain a second time. When that was done, he just nodded and looked over to where I had been pointing. There was still nothing there. Bigfoot had left the pond for good and was probably somewhere deep within the trees, enjoying his fish lunch. Dad didn't say much after that, only that he was sorry he missed it. I could tell he was thinking hard about something. Then came the words I had dreaded, that it was time to pack up our stuff and head home. I wasn't having it. In my mind, I had come so close to meeting our friendly neighborhood Sasquatch, and I didn't want to leave until we were proper buddies. Of course, now I understand my dad's apprehension. I don't think I was ever in any danger, being so far away from the creature when I did see it. But I also doubt that it would have been anywhere near as friendly as I would have hoped had it noticed me, or if I had gotten any closer to it. Still, I made things difficult, as I was wont to do at that age. I went full tantrum mode, crying and screaming until I was red in the face. Predictably, this made my brother cry as well. If there was any reason to believe that Bigfoot might have returned, we banished it the moment the two of us started wailing. Eventually, Dad was able to wait out our fits and took us, still sort of kicking and screaming, back to the car and back home. For a long time, I wouldn't let it go, what I saw and what it really was. To his credit, Dad believed me, but he was still reluctant to make any hard calls. Even so, that just wasn't where his mind was at the time or even today. He was much more concerned about our safety than coming to terms with his daughter seeing a real live Bigfoot. I didn't see the creature again after that. I think Dad purposely avoided going to that pond in particular following the events of that day. Suffice it to say, though, after that I spent a lot of time reading up on Bigfoot and imagining what it would have been like to actually befriend him and join him on adventures all around Moosehead Lake.